Well, thanks for coming. It's good to see familiar faces and some new people. Okay, well, my name's Tim. I'm a bit of a Noah's Ark fan, so and there's a bit of a story to that which I won't have time to get into tonight in much detail, but we'll see how we go. I do have quite a few slides, so we're starting at pretty much 7 o'clock, so we're aiming for 1 hour. And the title of this talk is Noah's Ark, Fact or Fiction? So we'll get straight into it with some action.
Somehow, Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, a loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do?
Okay, well, the argument there is about the Ark itself. That's the hull is incapable at that scale to be made of wood. So I've split some of the mocking areas of Noah's Ark into 4 categories. The Ark itself, that's the first one. There's the geology of the flood, whether a flood covered the whole world. And there's the biology side of it, animals, of course. And the 4th category is treating Noah's Ark as a myth. So saying that the story from the Bible comes from mythical stories of that time. So for people who are mocking the Bible, Noah's Ark's one of the favourite spots, interestingly. And that's probably why I picked it, which is the story. But the way it works, according to the Bible, Paul said that we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. And the type of thinking that, academic style of thinking that we have today is recognised as a Greek style of thinking. As a matter of fact, when Paul went to Athens, he went to the group of people who it says in the Bible that they used to sit around all day talking about the latest ideas. And when Paul comes along, they say, well, you know, who's this guy? What's all this rubbish he's talking about? But elsewhere in the Bible, it says things like this, where it says in 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give a defence to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. So it's not talking about ignoring their questions. It's asking you, it's telling you there to answer them. Another place it says we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Once again, we're debating and fighting at the level of arguments. So that could be a bit overwhelming for poor little Johnny there, because he sees all these attacks, and those could all be attacks against his belief. So he might be thinking something like, I'm a worshipper, not a scientist, which is exactly what the church did in the 1800s. When geologists started to say, looks like the earth is millions of years old, guys, they went, oh, okay, and folded and said, oh, maybe we can fit that into the Bible. So are our methods working? Are we catching, well, I mean, just about catching 100% of fish there. That's not happening. It's pretty scary, isn't it? 400 tonnes, that is. Herring. But as far as the Christian church is going, we don't seem to be catching fish quite that well In fact, this is the percentage of churchgoers in the United States in the last 50 or so years, and it's dropped. And here, this is in England, it's a lot worse. We've got them coloured according to their ages. So you'll notice the people under 20 have been decimated. So why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because people like to make fun of the Bible. There's lots of places you could make fun of it. Adam and Eve, plagues in Egypt, manna and miracles. I could read these all out, couldn't I? So you could say, well, you know, do you actually believe in a guy who walked around on water and raised from the dead and blah, 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 blah? Virgin birth. You could be mocked for that. But I think the biggest area of mockery is Noah's Ark itself. The story of Noah's Ark is kind of like the favourite thing to pick on if you want to attack the Bible. So it could feel a bit like you're the last one left. Or if you're talking about Noah's Ark, you might have a bunch of questions thrown at you. Like how you're going to feed all the animals, and how's a 150 metre boat going to survive, and a flood around the whole world, yeah, right? Interestingly, that's what I got when I got saved. So I was working in a medical equipment place and doing R&D stuff. And I got saved pretty dramatically. So I was super, super happy and just wanted to tell everybody. So I go to work and I'm grinning ear to ear probably without realising it. And the first guy there looked at me and said, "Oh, what happened to Tim on the weekend?" And they used to tease me about not having a girlfriend at the time, so I think he was inferring something. And I just walked up to him and I said, "Oh, God's real." I was about 2 feet away. And it almost, he sort of jumped back like I'd hit him or something. But all the people at work that I was talking to about God being real, I was having fun actually. It was fun. There was only 2 responses. They either said, "Oh, I knew God really well when I was young," or they said evolution. They immediately jumped on evolution. That was the only 2 responses. And in the 1990s, which is after then, this book came out, Telling Lies for God, and this guy is, we're going to mention him a bit later. So those 2 books there are my inspiration. Thought I'd just freak you out with that. So Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, that's an inspiration to me. And Telling Lies for God, that's my inspiration to pick Noah's Ark, because he spent an entire chapter ripping Noah's Ark apart. He thought that was his favourite. By the time I finished the book, I thought his favourite one to pick on was Noah's Ark. And with Charles Darwin's book, you know why that's a model to me? This is the way I see it. Darwin got a bee in his bonnet about something, and he wanted to hit back at God or the church. And he sat down. You know how long it took him to write that book? 20 years. So he disappeared for 20 years, sat down, wrote a book, crafted a book very carefully. If you read it, it's very carefully written. He says things like, "Oh, the argument that the eye is so amazing, it just doesn't seem like it could be made by evolution, does it?" He writes it that way, so it's quite difficult to argue with the book because he already presents your argument and then describes why it's not an argument. But he doesn't successfully do that, in my opinion, but he's still carefully crafted the book. So I liken it to this. It's like he went away, spent 20 years crafting a missile, and then shot it. Whereas as Christians, sometimes we sort of think, "Oh, I've got to do something tomorrow to do something for the kingdom of God. Bake some lamingtons and sell them," or something. So sometimes it's good to pull back and spend a bit more time. So I thought that was, well, that's what I got out of those 2 anyway. So here's the four areas of Noah's Ark. I'm going to pick on the first one. This is really my area. Out of those 4, I'm not really a biologist, so I'm going to fly through that area. There is plenty more on that. The geology part is one of my favourites. I would do geology if I had a long life like they did before Noah's time. Imagine living for 900 years, eh? You could have like 10 PhDs. Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't it be nice to be, an athlete for a couple of 100 years? I just thought I'd say that. So, unfortunately, we don't have that much time. Okay, so speaking of time, we better hit this one. This is the ark. I'm going to do this in fair bit of detail because this is my topic, but here we go. If you feel overwhelmed, that's good. That's the intention. Noah's Ark is too big for wood. There's Mr. Professor whatever saying, you heard him say earlier. That was Bill Nye at the Creation Museum a few years back, and he's quoting other people. In fact, the Wyoming that he mentioned there is the usual. They usually copy off each other. It's only one of several boats. He says it was the largest one ever built. There was a bunch of similar ones. Anyway, there's 2 books that I've written, or a book and a DVD that I've written, which covers some of this topic. But our first issue is the size of the ark. That's not it. We call them bathtub arks. It's about as big as a bathtub. The dimensions are in the Bible. It says 300 by 50 by 30 in cubits. And a cubit is the length of your elbow to fingertip. So here's an Egyptian cubit. And they were for a person around about 6'4". The Bibles that most people's Bibles on their bookshelf will say 18 inches for a cubit. I wrote a paper about that. That was one of the first decisions to make. What cubit do we use? And I said we should use the longer one. And they did what I said, which is pretty crazy. All right, so there's the ark. Compared to other ships that we know, I have used the Wyoming there as well. That's the sailing ship with 6 masts. And there's the Titanic, and there's the Queen Mary 2, which was the biggest passenger ship at the time. There's bigger ones now, but they're about that scale. So Noah's Ark is big-ish, but it's not stupid. It's not ridiculous. If it was 10 times that scale, yes, I would go, oops, the Bible's got a bit of a muff up there. Somebody's done something wrong. But it's actually not bad scale-wise. Okay, first of all, stability-wise, that can be fairly easily checked by the dimensions. That's the width and the height. And the width and the height of Noah's Ark is 50 by 30, 50 wide, 30 high, which is coincidentally happens to be just about exactly what they build ships, particularly cargo ships, about that same proportion. What a coincidence. So that's realistic. Some people think that the water would be too rough for the ark because some of the models for the flood involve tectonic movement, but tectonic movement is tidal wave stuff or tsunamis, and tsunamis are very safe in deep water. It's only at the shoreline that they're a danger. So in fact they're so low, even the tsunami, the Indonesian tsunami, was only 2 feet high in the ocean, which means you wouldn't notice it. They measured it by satellite. Going back to that geology professor that wrote the book Telling Lies for God, here he says, no vessel, let alone a highly unstable, twisting, leaking wooden ark, 50% longer than the USS Wyoming, there's that Wyoming again, could survive such conditions. He said that categorically in a video by the BBC. And in that same video, the reporter says, experts say it would have broken apart.
The problem with a 450-foot boat made of wood is that the wood as a material cannot maintain the shape of the boat. And the boat would start to distort at sea, the seams would open up, and it would sink.
It's a safe bet that the huge ark would spring hundreds of leaks along the length of its huge hull and sink like a stone.
I give up. That's just, that's so convincing, we might as well go home now, I think. What do you think? So they do sound convincing. And in fact, if you've ever watched two sides of an argument or a debate, you listen to one speak and you think, oh, gee, they sound convincing, don't they? Then you listen to the other one and think, well, maybe they're right. Well, here's some more experts. These are the naval architects that work in Korea. Korea, by the way, makes more ships than any other country. And they have ship research centres. I've got 3 or 4 of them. One of their main ones is CRISO, and they did a study on Noah's Ark, which was commissioned by creationists in Korea, but it was done by the workers at the Ship Research Centre. It was quite a fundamental test. They just changed the proportions of the ark, and all they were checking was, are those proportions optimal for testing the ark in terms of seakeeping and strength and stability. So in other words, how does it ride over the waves? Will it break in half? And will it roll over? And if you make it shorter and fatter, it'll make it very rough. If you make it longer and narrower so that it's not as rough, it's more likely to break. And if you change the proportions, make it wider, for example, then the seakeeping, it'll become very bouncy. And if you make it taller, of course, stability becomes an issue. So you have to balance these things, and when you balance them, you end up towards the ark's proportions. Not that they're magical. You build a ship exactly those proportions, it's all of a sudden 10 times better, but it's like the top of the curve. It's around the right dimensions or proportions. So there's Dr. Hong, who was the head of that study. Professor Na was professor of structural engineering as well, so he would have done the FEA on it. Look what he says on his website. Sea is the origin of life. Just in case you thought they were a bunch of crazy Koreans who go to some, hand-clapping church or something, these are not Christians. They're doing the study completely as a textbook style, and they're just checking those dimensions. Do they make sense? And their conclusion was yes. In fact, he's listed the study in his CV. So it's an actual technical journal article. So Jeremy Bowen is saying experts say it will break apart. Dr. Hong is saying it's fine, it can survive 30-metre waves, which looks like that. That's a 30-metre wave. Check that out, 7 hours going backwards with hard left rudder on full. That's fun. We don't want that to happen. This is a bit of a story behind this one. You don't want to know the story behind this one. This is an oil tanker, and it started getting a crack in the hull, and it was off the coast of Spain. So Spain freaks out and goes, "Oh, you're not coming into our port." And they said, "There's a storm coming. We're not letting you here." International law says they're supposed to, but they didn't want the oily, leaky tanker near their shore. So it sank 4 kilometres deep, which is the normal depth for the ocean, by the way, 4 kilometres deep. Like submarine can only go a couple of 100 metres. So it's really hard to get to the bottom. Well, it sank all the way to the bottom, and guess where all the oil went? All over Spain's beaches. That was dumb. People laughed at it, but it wasn't actually very funny. It was billions of dollars cleaning that up. Okay, first thing about a hull is when it rides over waves, it gets bent. So it's like a bridge. When you have 2 waves, it's acting like a bridge. But then when you have 1 wave in the middle, it's a reversed bridge. This makes a lot of work. It's really giving the hull a hard test. So the hull has to be built as strong as a bridge. In fact, stronger because it goes it's loaded in both directions. All right, we've got the dimensions of Noah's Ark in the Bible. There it is in Hebrew. 300 by 50 by 30. There's no debate over that. That is clear as a bell. I remember when I was studying this first and started to realise how good those dimensions were. I remember thinking, it's a wonder there's not somebody in the world who has actually gotten saved by Genesis 6:15. I actually thought that. And one of the naval architects I was working with, this guy's a PhD naval architect, mostly designing oil rigs. So he told me that he was doing Noah's Ark, the Noah story, and he wasn't really a Christian at the time. He's just doing it because he got roped in to do it. But when he saw the dimensions and the explanation, he realised, yeah, that makes sense. That's a cargo ship. Yep, that all makes sense. And that's the first time he started to think, hang on, this is an account, not a myth, not a mythical story. So in fact, that's what he says was the main thing that led him to become a Christian. So I actually met a person who got saved by Genesis 6:15. That's cool. And these are some illustrations of some of the ideas that we use in the Ark Encounter were originally coming from Alan. So there's this cross-section of the Ark. It looks like there's more than 3 decks there. I'll explain that later. And there's there's his version of an ark. Just speaking of wooden vessels, this is a photograph of wooden vessels built during World War I, where they ran out of steel. So they needed supply ships to carry supplies. So they built wooden ones, and we got records of those. The ones in the 1800s we didn't record very well. Look how thick the wood is. This is looking towards the stern, the back of the ship. This is towards the bow, the front of the ship. Look at the size of the wood there. And the other reason that they made them out of wood is they could make them really quick. And they had plenty of big trees in America too. That team is holding up a sign. You can't read the sign probably unless you come up close. You know what it says? We erected this hull in 72 hours. 72 hours work by that team. Okay, we're talking quick. Now, here I am comparing the size of the largest wooden ship that we have in record of, the Great Republic 1855 one, with Noah's Ark on an 18-inch cubit. So there's a midsection of the two side by side, or with the larger Royal Cubit 21-inch cubit there, makes the Ark bigger. So that's the Royal Cubit that I mentioned. So I made a model. You can see bits of it here. These are actually the ones that Alan Magnuson specified. So this is the back part, the parallel middle section's not here, and the bow at the front. So it's very standard ship-like, really. Pretty much the same hull as you would build a modern ship, except fairly rectangular. It's not as streamlined as you would normally make them. Because a modern ship is designed to travel forwards, whereas Noah's Ark has really only one job to do, and that's to float. But there's a bit more to it than that, because you don't want to be going sideways.
Working with 2 naval architects on the other side of the world, Tim quickly discovered that the familiar box shape would not fare so well at sea. The flat sides and bottom would give the passengers a very rough and even dangerous ride. Tim built several 6-foot models for some open water testing. One of his models was built to the specifications of a PhD naval architect. The model turned and aligned with the wind, in contrast to the box-like boat that rocked sideways on the waves. He took this discovery and applied it to his proposed model of the Ark. Was this a logical model based on information given in the book of Genesis?
Well, we ended up using this design. That picture that you're looking at there is the actual picture that I used to sell the design, and which they said, yes, we'll do that, which was a bit radical. Because before that they had a completely rectangular box. The extra bits though is this sail at the front, which is showing, which is at the bow side, and the skeg, which looks like a rudder at the back. And what the job of them is when the wind is blowing, that's what creates waves. So when there are waves and wind, the wind will steer the ark lengthwise in the waves, otherwise it will naturally go sideways. If it naturally goes sideways, then God should have made a shorter one. Why is it so long and skinny? So if you take a typical lifeboat, they're about 4-to-1, whereas Noah's Ark's like longer than that, 6-to-1. So that's one clue. It also means it's going to ride much more comfortably than rocking sideways violently. Doesn't mean we necessarily have heavy waves like that all the time, but in Genesis 8:1 it says God sent a wind. This is the drying stage. So wind will make waves, you can't get around that. So we did end up actually building this ark, which is now sitting in Kentucky, and this was built in 2016. This would be early 2016. And you can see that's the rear of it, and the other side is the front. Well, here we are with an ark that I designed. Oops, hope it works. Okay, so we're standing in front of the ark. It's getting late now, so this is the last bit of light. They're building a frame behind me, which is going towards the stern. So these frames have a large pole piece in the centre, and then we have a crane behind, which is lifting these parts into the stern. You can see the siding here, which is actually radiata pine with a preservative. Just looking at the keel itself, this is the outer keel, and we're sitting underneath the radius of the bilge, so you can see it there. That's a good place to stop. It's nice when you're sitting underneath it because you can really feel the size of it as it comes up. Talking about those keels as well, I'll mention some of the design things that we threw in to make it work better. But if you're building a ship that big, they said, oh, you can't do it. Even the guys that built it in the 1800s, trying to do the Wyoming, they had to have metal reinforcing, still didn't work. So how are you going to do it then? Well, according to the Korean study, they actually put some numbers in there, and one of them was that the frames would be 50 by 50, which is pretty close to what we used at the Ark Encounter, the one you just saw. And the plate structure, little words there, 2 words, plate structure, which means an awful lot, is the planking. However, plate structure means that it's completely stiff. The problem with the ships of the 1800s is that the planking wasn't stiff, which Bill Nye failed to tell you. He was saying, oh, they're da-da-da-da-da-da, and they were the best shipbuilders in the... No, they weren't. They were knocking out ships as fast as they possibly could. By the way, the Wyoming lasted 14 years. And they got their money back multiple times. They sold it at a profit to another company. And it was a storm that knocked it out, by the way. And if they built them properly, which they had been doing at the time, because they were starting to use different methods besides the standard planking. You see, the standard planking was parallel planks, but there's absolutely nothing to stop that from sliding, apart from the caulking in between the planks, which works great for the first year or so until it softens up. And then, because you start off with a tight ship, that's the word, tight ship. And then after a little while, you're going to get a loose ship.
According to Tom Vosmer, an expert on ancient boats, not even 19th century engineers could have built a 450-foot ark out of wood alone. They had to use steel frames inside much smaller wooden boats just to keep them afloat.
So what are they talking about, steel frames there? This is one of the solutions, the main solution they came up with in the 1800s. Wooden ships are getting up around the 300-foot mark, so they put steel, or they called it iron back then, iron strapping, diagonal strapping through the side of the hull, which helped. Didn't work perfectly though, because the ends of the straps dig into the wood, so you have an overstress points when you're trying to connect to the wood. It's trying to fix a bad design, basically. So here's an illustration of a wooden ship like that, and you see the iron strapping underneath the planking. Then they kept going a bit later in the 1800s. They were starting to use iron, and here we have iron framed boats. So this is called a composite boat. It's got wooden planking with iron structure, and they went a bit more to town with the iron diagonals this time, because as I said, the tops of those diagonals would dig into the wood, so they had to put steel up there as well. So they're heading towards a steel boat. There is another way to make the hull stay together, and that is to have multiple layers of planks. That's what the Chinese did in the 1500s. They had up to 7 layers of planks. You know what they do? Once the boat started to get a bit loose, they bring it back, dry dock it, and nail on another layer of planks. They start off with like 3, 4, 5, 6. By the time they got up to 7, the boat's getting a bit heavy, we'll just retire it now. That's so Chinese, eh? They are just so pragmatic. While the Europeans are making little carved, statues, the Chinese would slap on another layer of planks that worked. Right, so even just 2 layers makes a massive difference. It's vastly superior to a single layer. And that's because the second layer is keying into the first layer and stopping it from sliding. So it's actually very effective. Turns out that Darwin, the boat that he went on, the Beagle, was double planked. Not that that's got anything to do with it, but anyway. But the best way to do it is diagonal planking. This is by far the best way to make a wooden vessel. They did do that in the 1800s, particularly England, because they had limited wood supply. The Americans just slap them together. They just get bigger trees if they want a stronger boat. But the English had to be careful with their wood, so they refined the design, and they were coming up with diagonal planking, usually 4 layers parallel, and then 45 the other way, and then parallel again. And they worked fantastic. But at the time, metal was starting to take over, so that's what would have happened. And that's what we do with modern wooden boats. It's called cold moulded, and we have 45-degree layers of wood. As a matter of fact, that's what they did when they built mine hunters, because they couldn't use steel, otherwise the mines would pick it up magnetically. So they made them out of wood, and they planked them with 45-degree planking. One of those, you may have remembered, came into trouble in the Philippines, ended up on a reef and got stuck, and that wasn't real good, especially since it was like a national park thing. That would normally smash a boat apart, by the way, so it's pretty strong that can even survive there for a couple of weeks. There it is. They chainsawed it up, and you can see the diagonal planking quite clearly there. So that's the way to build a ship. However, we don't have any ancient examples of diagonal planking. What we do have, though, is this intriguing method of putting planks together, which was only discovered fairly recently, last few decades. They used to read Greek accounts of this sort of planking coming apart in the sea, and they think, what on earth are they talking about? And it was when they had underwater archaeology that they actually discovered planks like this. And this is how the Greeks built their ships, the triremes, and that's how they kept them light. They were light enough for the crew to pull the ship up onto the beach so it didn't get waterlogged, but strong enough to ram another vessel. So they're way superior to the sailing ships of the 1800s. That's exactly what the author of, well, pretty much one of the first people to really do ship archaeology, which is Lionel Casson, that's what he actually says. These ships, the ancient Greek ones, are the best wooden ships ever built. And this is what they did. They made each plank joined to the next plank using mortise and tenon joints. What a lot of work. That's way too much work for the 1800s. They want to slap them up in 2 or 3 months. They're not going to sit there mortising out every plank. That's hard work. But it works really well because it locks each plank, stops it from slipping. So we've got 4 techniques for making a strong hull. We can have diagonal planking. That's great. Problem is, we don't see any history showing that one. Multiple layers does work as well, and there is plenty of historical examples of that. Even the Greek ones often had double planking, particularly on the bottom, and that works really well, but it's not exciting enough. No, it's just like... The other one is we're not going to have metal straps in there, even though metal was being used before Noah built the ark, because we have Cain's descendant, who was the person who began metal work in bronze and iron. So, but the edge-jointed planking, that goes in ancient Greek days, and we're talking centuries BC. As a matter of fact, once again, Lionel Casson says, we don't know when it started, that technique, but the Romans did it, and it just disappeared and was never resurrected. In fact, none of the modern ships were ever built that way. Well, almost.
An ingenious construction method seen in ancient shipbuilding that used edge-jointed planking puts the BBC's faulty claims to rest.
In this exhibit of the ark under construction, we're treating the planking as exactly the same way as the Greeks did the planks. When Greeks built their ships, the large ships, they used to use multiple layers of planking. And they had this special trick where they had joints in between each plank. And you can see the joint here, they're a tenon, and they fit into a mortise in the adjacent plank. And that locks the 2 planks together. There's no way they can move, there's no way that they can break a seal and let the water in. This is a very advanced technique. In fact, it wasn't even seen at all in any of the ships built in the last few centuries in Europe and America. We believe this method would allow the ship, the Noah's Ark, to be built without any problems at all with movement of the planks and leaking, which did plague some very large wooden ships. So you can make a ship as large as Noah's Ark out of wood. This is the design I've got for Noah's hull. We've got 5 layers of planks towards the bottom, which 2 of them, the 2 layers on the outside are sacrificial, so if you bump something, that can just rip off. But you've got 3 layers doing the structural work there. The frames are also keyed together, and you've also got a layer of wood on the inside, which was common in the 1800s, and those are also keyed together so that it can't slide. So there's a lot of ways of stopping slipping there. And if you were to travel through the hull itself, that's what this shot would be showing. You can see the different fasteners. There's a bit of work to work out, make sure you don't interfere with the fasteners, particularly when you have multiple layers. And that's where you can take advantage of using wooden nails, which work really well because once the wood gets wet, it expands. As a matter of fact, they're superior to steel because steel would dig into the wood. But you lock the whole thing up with iron bolts at the end, which should work pretty good. There's a view of the Ark Encounter. You can see the bottom layer, that would be layer 5 coming up, and you see the other layer underneath it. So I just put extra layers on the bottom for abrasion. And there's a cross-section. Me and my son went over to build this. In the entry door of the Ark Encounter, we're showing a cross-section as if you'd cut through the hull, and that's showing the 5 layers of planks there with the mortise and tenon, with the pegs. And this is inside the Ark itself. The general structure of that is pretty close to what I specified for Noah's Ark. So a lot of those beams, they're mostly 16 to 20 inch square. And you see those big round tree trunks. That was kind of my idea to give us a bit of a, I thought it looked cool. But there's no need really for Noah to saw everything up into square if it's not being used as a square. And also it meant that they could be nice and tall. So the inside of the Ark is pretty close. Of course, one of the big differences is that this is bolted together. We're expecting Noah's Ark to be a bit different. So some of the things that I added that is not written in the Bible, well, some of them are. You only have quite a short instruction for Noah to build from. For example, it doesn't say how many animals are coming. So Noah's got to somehow make all the cages without knowing how many animals? I doubt it. So obviously those instructions are summarised. He would have been given more detail than that. Just like David was given details for making the temple. Well, it would be probably more than we see in the Bible. So, but some of the things for the Ark Encounter that I did, I changed from a rectangular hull, which they had before. I chose the Royal Cubit, which is the longer one, which makes the whole project 40% more volume. Adds 40% to the price. Sorry about that, guys. And then I raced back to Australia. I put 3 keels on the bottom because Noah could then build the hull without it tipping over. And plus a bunch of other things, it can start skidding. And it also means that the outer keels act for stopping, reducing roll. They act like a bilge keel. And we've got the skeg at the back and the sail at the front, so it wind steers. The extra layers, 4 and 5. And I've got the Ark up high so that Noah can get underneath to plank it. And the mezzanine levels, so there's 3 levels according to Genesis 6, but we split some of those levels up because you've got enough headroom so you can service cages and things. So mezzanine levels added in, and a few other bits. The other thing I specified was a lot of the structural sizes inside and also the floor beams. I made them square and fairly widely spaced, like 6 feet spacing. Notice it's all in imperial. When I go over to America, I work in inches. Now, that's pretty good, actually. You get used to it. And then that meant that the floor has to span 6 feet, so they couldn't use normal floorboards, so they come up with a 4-inch thick floorboard, which nicely meant that they changed their different category of fire rating and made it much easier for the sprinkling. So there's lots of funny things like that. But what's the main difference between the Ark Encounter and Noah's Ark design that we're proposing? Now, the two main things would be the thickness of the hull itself. So the Ark Encounter is really just a pretend skin, whereas so it's about 2 inches thick. You've got cladding of 1 inch and then some plywood behind that. But Noah's Ark's hull is about 75 inches thick, which is quite a bit. And also the internal structure in the Ark Encounter, as you saw, was bolted together with metal brackets. Whereas I suspect Noah could use something like bronze straps that are spiked and tensioned up. The Ark itself is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a balance between these 3 factors, or at least the Korean study did these 3 factors: strength, stability, and comfort. So engineering-wise, it's possible. We've got experts saying, yes, you could definitely do this. So when they wave their hands and say, shipbuilders had trouble, so therefore it can't be done, that's not good enough. In fact, there was a very large wooden yacht built only in the last couple of years, which is about the 150 metre mark, diagonal planking as you'd expect, out of wood, completely out of wood. So are you overwhelmed yet? You're supposed to be overwhelmed. That's good. That's a bit like this guy. He's walking around Jericho. You know, he's overwhelmed because you know what he was expecting. He thought he signed up for a worship session. I'm slack, aren't I? So think about it though. Are we supposed to be fighting against theoretical arguments about whether or not Noah's Ark can survive? Yes, because Noah's Ark has probably kicked a lot of people out of church. And the answers are there. It's answerable. And it's not actually all that hard. It's funny because as I studied Noah's Ark, I'm only studying a little part of the Bible, but it becomes more and more solid. It's like concrete. It's not like, if it was wrong, like if those proportions were stupid, like 10 times the scale or something, you'd be halfway through and thinking, this is getting messy. Well, it doesn't actually get messy. It gets cleaner and cleaner. It's like, wow, this is amazing. I had 4 categories. Here's another one. Geology. No evidence of a worldwide flood. Well, first of all, there's a lot of water on the Earth. That's an actual photograph of the Earth. You can't even see any land. That's pretty funny. 4 kilometres deep, by the way. So if you spread out the Earth so that there's no humps, that's all smooth, we're 3 kilometres underwater. We're lucky we've got any land to stand on. Here's a question. Did God create the Blue Mountains? And if so, when? So there's a picture of the 3 sisters, right? And I've heard people say, oh, God created these lovely Blue Mountains, which is sort of true, but when? So when were the 3 sisters made? Now, if you got in and got some of those rocks out, you'll find dead animals in them, fossils. And if you studied fossils long enough, you'd find fossils with diseased bones and animals attacking each other. So when was the 3 sisters made? When was those mountains made? We're referring to pretty much everything you see on the planet is affected and a remnant of Noah's flood. So when people say, oh, there's no evidence of a flood, they're referring to, oh, I can't see 1 inch of mud all over the earth, because they're thinking like little river flood. Well, actually, the tsunami in Asia wasn't 1 inch, by the way. There were tens of metres of sediment, but a world-scale flood will deposit kilometres of sediment, absolutely pulverise the place, and lay down pretty much all of the sedimentary layers that we see, particularly when they're layers. Here's 6 evidences of a worldwide flood, which I could go through in detail, which we won't be doing. But I'll just read some of these out. Fossils of sea creatures high above the sea level, like Mount Everest, for example. Rapid burial of plants and animals. We have fossils of a fish eating another fish. I mean, excuse me, you're saying that the animal dies and then slowly gets covered with sediment? Well, how can a fish be eating another fish and then fossilise? Or there's dinosaurs sitting on a nest, fossilised. We have rapidly deposited layers spread across vast areas. That's a really good one. I think that's probably the number one for a global flood. That those deposits are so big that they would cover half the country. How on earth does any animal survive? Like the Three Sisters, for example, that rock goes all the way under Sydney up to the Hunter Valley. How did that happen? There's nothing happening today that's making rock like that. Sediment transported long distances, they can identify some volcanic rocks from one spot and then hundreds of kilometres further down they're all rolled smooth and deposited. Huge currents going on. There's hardly any erosion between layers. If there's supposed to be millions and millions of years between layers, there should be erosion, cutouts between the layers, but they're dead flat. And it shows that it's happened quickly. So the flood itself, we expect happened quite suddenly. We've got mechanisms for how that flood happened, which I can mention right at the end. But there's 2 ways to look at this. The evolution idea says that everything came out of millions of years, and death and struggle is what created everything. Or the biblical idea is that God created everything, and death and struggle came in through sin, and it's the enemy of God's creation. So if there really was a worldwide flood, what would we expect to see? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. That's Ken Ham line there. Thought I'd throw that in. Here's a fish fossil. All right, so you might see pictures like this in the zoo or aquarium place. You know, the fish dies and lands on the bottom and the sediment slowly covers it. That's rubbish. The bottom of the ocean or lake is full of critters that eat food. And they eat whatever's buried. 10 metres deep. Dummy. 10 metres? So how are you going to make a fossil again? You can't unless you deposit 10 metres. And anyway, they don't even do that. When a fish dies, they get eaten. And when it floats to the bottom, sinks to the bottom, the lobsters and whatever eats the rest. And there's nothing left. So we're not making any fossils today. Very, very unusual. You might fall in a bog or something, that's about it. We're not making fossils. It has to be a sudden deposit to form such an intricate, perfect, photographic looking fossil as that. So fossilization doesn't take millions of years, by the way, either. That can happen quite quickly. Depends on the amount of minerals in the water. That's it. So we have fossilized examples of pipes. You might have to build a mine and you're pumping water out. The pipe can clog up with rock because it deposits on the sides of the pipe. So in like a decade. That's fossilization, making minerals. So God could have created the Blue Mountains. Or Noah's flood could have created the Blue Mountains. And Noah's flood works better because the rocks themselves have these flat layers in them. If you look at the cliff on the other side, you'll see the same rock on the Three Sisters side. Exactly the same rock. And then you look in the far distance, you see the same rock again. It's all one big flat layer. And it's been carved out by erosion towards the end of the flood. So you can do a little bit of water slowly, but it doesn't explain the big layers. Or you can do lots of water quickly, which will carve out the canyon, but it also explains the layers. By the way, you can make layers really quickly as well. These are layers made by Mount St Helens, which happen in like one day. And there's about 30 metre high cliff of layers like that. And geologically, if you see layers on an angle like that, that usually means it was like a sand dune travelling along through the bottom of the water. And then it got carved off and a new sediment laid on top. So it doesn't mean millions of years at all. And what if you see that? How are you going to explain that with millions of years? That's a big rock in the middle of a bunch of layers. What about this one? That's a tree trunk through what's supposed to be millions of years of layers. That's called a polystrate fossil. You've got to do some pretty curly explanations to get around that one. Speaking of explanations, how do you explain a T-Rex bone that was too heavy to be lifted by helicopter, so they had to saw it in half, and while they're sawing it, they could smell something. I thought, that's a bit weird, so they took it back to the lab, and they found that it wasn't fossilised on the inside. And they went, wow, that's amazing. How did that last 65 million years? Or it's not 65 million years old. Make more sense. But it's definitely, I think, probably what the best reason to say that geology points to a worldwide flood would be the big flat layers. There's no other explanation, particularly when they're full of fossils. So there's animals there, and they got covered in sediment. I thought I'd just throw another one at you. If you feel like, this isn't really, this is geology, it's too much, complicated, blah, 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 I'm not a scientist. The theologians in the 1800s, the geologists would say, the Earth's millions of years old. And they go, I'm a theologian. It's like, no. Argue. That's what Paul did. When Paul went to evangelise somewhere, he would speak their language. He wasn't going, they didn't listen to what I was saying, so they're not ready. No, he spoke their language. He went to the Greeks and said, I noticed you got this God, unknown God, and started talking to them. Guess what he started with, by the way, when he's talking to the Greeks? He started with creation. He said, there's a God who made everything, blah, blah, blah. He didn't say, Jesus fulfills the Passover, because they didn't have that language yet. So he had to start right at the beginning, back to creation. So that was really very fast geology there. And I'll go even faster with the animals, so I don't waste too much time. 30 million species on board, huh? Well, the 30 million, by the way, is mostly beetles. There's a few what do they call them? Entomologists who want to get their names on lots of beetles, I think. First of all, what needs to go on Noah's Ark is the animals. In fact, it specifically says animals with breath in their nostrils in the text. So insects breathe through their skin, so that could be enough reason to kick all the insects out. Plus also there's a lot of floating matter on the water, like tree trunks. So they would be able to survive on those. A lot will get killed, of course. In fact, lots of things got exterminated, like poor little trilobites. It would be nice to have trilobites. I'd love to have a pet trilobite. That would be cool. And so we take all the insects out, the arthropods, and then we take out the fish and stuff as well, and we're left with mammals, reptiles and birds, and that knocks it down to about 17,000. But we can keep going because what we consider to be species today is not necessarily what Noah had. For example, a lion is a species, Panthera leo, and a tiger is Panthera tigris. So that's funny because you can breed the two. Biggest cat in the world is a combination of a lion and tiger. So the creationist model is that God created, and then they can breed out into the various subkinds, and they can speciate. And it can be that they're not able to mate after a certain amount of time. They might be too different. So Noah doesn't have to take every type of dog on the ark. As a matter of fact, they reckon probably only 3 types would breed out to all the dogs we have today. And also, he doesn't need to take all the animals at full scale, full size. You can take them when they're young. So there's lots of study on that, and it looks like Noah would be taking something in the order of 5,000 to 10,000 animals, which is feasible, particularly if you automate some of the things like feeding and drinking. If you deal with drinking, first of all, the others are quite manageable. You could maintain them about once a week. People even talk about how impossible the manure situation would be. But generally speaking, in cold climates, like in Norway, when they have the animals 6 months inside, they don't even clean up the poo at all. Just leave it on the floor. So it stinks, and then you get used to the stink. So Noah's Ark probably did stink. That would be reasonably. So yes, we could go on more details about the animals, but the general idea is that the animals are not exactly the same as we have today. They're the predecessors of what we have now, out of which the modern animals could have bred. By the way, God is the one who selected the animals as well, so he would have selected ones with a nice big gene pool, healthy animals that could breed out and generate what we have today. And what we have today is a little bit like a pedigree. So with dogs, if you breed the dogs and you go, I just want the ones with the funny nose and the short legs, and you keep selecting them, select, they get sicker and sicker and sicker. So if you have a pedigree dog, I'm sorry for you, going to the vet all the time, but they are less healthy. And farmers know that. When they're trying to get cows to breed for milk, they end up getting other problems, and they have to bring in new blood to keep them healthy. So pedigree is bad. Mixed is good. So interbreeding or inbreeding is a bad thing. And that's actually what's happened naturally since Noah. So for example, cheetahs are not very healthy. They have a lot of trouble breeding because they've got problems, and there's not enough variation in the cheetahs today to bring in new blood. So they're worried about them. That's weird. If they believe in evolution, why are they worried about cheetahs? Aren't they going to fix themselves? Which is, they made themselves in the first place from 2. So how can they? Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Because evolution says things are getting better. But when we look at creation, they were better and they're getting worse. It's decaying. It's going downhill. So we're all going downhill, guys. Sorry about that. Less and less healthy. We go bald and stuff like that. The last one out of those 4. It's a legend. I'll spend a little bit more time on this one. So the idea behind this is that the story of Noah's Ark in the Bible is not the original story. They're saying that the story comes from other stories. Here's a guy who says that Noah's Ark story refers to a flood that was a local flood. And he's referring here to the Epic of Gilgamesh as an example, which was deciphered in England, in a museum. And this story is quite similar to Noah's Ark. So when they found it, went, oh, look at this. This story is older than the Bible, of course, because we know when the Bible was written. The Bible was written, the Genesis account was written a few centuries before Jesus. They'd already made their minds up about that in the late 1800s. And here we are in the 1900s, when they find the Epic of Gilgamesh, they go, oh, we know Genesis was written, a few hundred BC, So therefore, since this was written, well over 1000 BC, therefore Genesis copied the Epic of Gilgamesh when they were in exile. Oh, that sounds like a good story. There's only one problem. They've decided that Genesis was written a few hundred BC. That was a theory brought up in the late 1800s, mainly from Germany, where they said that the early parts of the Bible were compiled by authors during the exile in Babylon. So they're saying that Noah's Ark was made up by the Babylonians, and then the story was copied and put into the Bible. That's what the Babylonian Ark looks like. Right, it's not ship-like. The scale, by the way, is a bit weird. It's got 7 stories. Have fun with that. So who copied who? If one of them is ridiculous and one of them makes a lot of sense, you would expect that the one that makes a lot of sense was the original, not corrupted, or not corrupted anything like this one, which is obviously corrupted. And it happens all around the world. Yeah, see, he thinks the local flood, that'll solve the problems. This is little Benny. He just found out that Santa's not true. So he's wondering about Noah's Ark. That's one of the problems. You find out Santa's not true, and then the little funny pictures of Noah's Ark, which obviously aren't realistic, are up for grabs as well. But you could always ask the question to your mum, why did Noah have to take birds? See, if it's a local flood, why would Noah have birds? Birds can fly halfway around the world. So it's a local flood. Why is there birds on board? If it's a local flood, why can't he just walk? There's going to be a flood in 120 years. Start walking. I think I'd go for the walking option. It's a lot easier than that ark. That's a lot of work. By the way, if you ever get Christian burnout, just think of Noah's Ark. You're going to make it how long? Imagine him out in his backyard pacing out 150 metres and looking at it and think, are you serious? So there's a lot of problems with a local flood. Don't need birds. Why would you build a boat? How's it going to cover mountains? Why would it take a year? Half of that time was waiting for the water to dry out. All of the high hills under the whole heaven covered. And how come Noah and his family are the only ones who survive? What, everyone else is killed by a local flood? And in the New Testament, as Jesus said, the flood came and destroyed them all. And Peter says 8 souls were saved. That's Noah and his wife and his 3 kids and their wives. How about this one? At the end of the flood, God gave the rainbow as a sign that he won't flood a global flood again. So if it was a local flood, he gave a sign that he wouldn't do a local flood again? That doesn't work. Or what about a local flood covering mountains? You could come up with some theory for that? That's difficult. You see, if we try and fit evolution into the Bible, one of the biggest problems is that those rocks that the 3 sisters are made of are full of dead animals that are millions of years old, according to evolution. That means Adam and Eve were standing in the Garden of Eden, standing on top of fossils of dead animals that have died for millions of years. It's not going to work. And that's when God said it's very good too. What? Full of dead animals with cancer in their bones. What it looks like, Noah's flood looks like it was an account. It's got a lot of detail about the number of days and things. So it looks like Noah kept a diary on board. That story, by the way, could be passed down very easily to Moses. There's the people and the overlaps between them. As a matter of fact, Adam lived until Methuselah, so they could be talking to each other. Methuselah could easily talk to Noah. Noah could have talked to almost Abraham. Noah's son could talk to Abraham. And Abraham's not too far off from Moses. And you need about 5 people and you can go all the way from the creation story to Moses. So it's not ancient, dim, distant past history, prehistoric. It's quite recent. So after the flood, they took the story with them wherever they dispersed. We're pretty sure we know where the ark landed. By the way, where did the ark start from? We don't know. The whole world's underwater, and it says the ark travelled about on the surface of the waters. And it did that for about 5 months, so it could travel right around the globe. Maybe it started in Blacksland. Maybe that's where it was built. Because they all came from the same place to restart the world, they remembered the story, and that's why we have flood stories in all sorts of tribes all around the world. And the first one that I mentioned, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is one of the closest ones to the Bible. It's quite accurate. But even the Australian Aborigines, and there's a whole bunch of them all around the world there, have flood stories that have lots of things in common, like man being evils causing it. It was gods who created the destruction. You'd have different names and things, but and some details different, but the general story is very similar, which is what you would expect if their ancestors told this story, particularly verbally, and they lost some of the details along the way. And having to build a ship, destruction by water, having animals on board. Right, and so that makes a lot of sense. That's what you should see, because all of the people in all of the tribes around the world are all descended from Noah. And interestingly, they building big things was something that ancient people seemed to be right into, which is what you would expect. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, spend their entire life building this jolly ark. And you'd be like, oh, all they ever know is building big stuff. So they come off and the first thing they do is build the Tower of Babel, because they're just builders. And then they get dispersed, and so they go all around the world building more big things, like pyramids. And in fact, pyramids are all over the place, in China as well, in South America. So as I mentioned earlier, where was the Garden of Eden? We don't know. When they came off the ark, they saw some rivers and said, okay, well, we'll call that Euphrates, because that's what they knew for a river name back in before the flood. That's like in Australia. We have Newcastle in Australia. Where'd they get that name from? It comes from England. We had a place when we were in America called London down the road. That was fun. So that's normal thing for a human to do. Get off and name it after a name. By the way, those rivers don't match. If you read it carefully, it talks about the Euphrates splitting into 4 rivers. It doesn't happen here. So that theory doesn't work. They're just using the names from the old world. Right, so we have engineering, geology, biology, history, parts of Noah's flood, and all of them can be covered, and they've all got good explanations. I think geology is probably one of the strongest areas for defending a short Earth. It works so much better than trying to get millions of years of making rocks and fossils. Doesn't work at all. And engineering-wise, which was my main area, Noah's Ark is definitely feasible. It could be built. And that's what we built with the Ark Encounter. So I do have some of those videos here, but I couldn't find the book. I did edit that book this year, so we added a few more pages at the back, but haven't got any copies with me. I do have some of the little famous books along the way. I'll just say quickly, there's that Telling Lies for God one. That's the one that went, I'm going to study Noah's Ark now. I'm an engineer, so I wasn't going to study, the days of creation and the animals and stuff. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? But we got the specifications, 300 by 50 by 30, and 3 levels, and gopher wood, and pitch, and dimensions about the window and stuff. This is the book that started creationism, pretty much. 1960s it was published. And the guy who one of the guys who wrote that's on my video, which was good, John Wickham. It's the book, and notice that it's about Noah's flood. That's what started creationism. I think Noah's flood is actually the best area, because once you understand the flood and its effect on your understanding of what you see, then everything else makes sense. You don't need the millions of years once all the rock layers can be laid down quickly, which makes more sense because there's big flat layers that don't happen slowly, can't happen slowly. So that's a big one. So what happened was, I sent the designs of this ark to the Creation Museum, and I got urgency to work on this because the museum is being built, and I wanted to make sure that they didn't build some Noah's Ark details that somebody could walk in and go, oh, that's wrong, that wood's too small, that's not going to work. So I thought, oh, we should get onto it as fast as we can to be ready for the Creation Museum. And so I was talking to the director there, and he said, oh, just send us some models, we need to get some models made. So I sent him the CAD file. I didn't hear anything. So I waited about 2 weeks and emailed back and said, did you use my CAD model? And he goes, yeah. The model maker's building it in California. And I went, oh, okay. I hope I'm right. And then about a year later, when I'm working at the Creation Museum, Ken Ham had a meeting. Because what happened was we started painting a picture of Noah's Ark on the cafe wall. Great big picture, like big as this wall here. And all the admin people would be walking past looking at this. What on earth is that? Because I totally changed the ark from a rectangular box to this thing. And so Ken had a meeting, said, okay, we've got to decide, we can't have two arks. Are we going to have a square one, or are we going to have this fancy one? And so that was the actual picture that won the day, which is kind of funny. I also got away with the longer cubit at the same time, and a bunch of other things. But I'm really glad it came out like that, because had that been a rectangular box, people would have driven past and gone, wow, that's a big barn. But when you get there, it just goes, ship. It so hits you in the face really well. Ship. That was a P. Yeah. Ship. Noah's Ark's feasible. The text doesn't have any mistakes in it. There's nothing there that's a worry. And scientifically, things like geology make more sense with Noah's flood than without it. By studying a tiny little bit of the Bible in fairly high detail just shows you that it's absolute concrete. It is absolute rock solid. And the more you push on it, the harder it is. It's really amazing.